I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Sally Bachman, and I'm the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice, also known as SP2. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you to our third virtual installment of this year's speaker series, Conversations about Race, Equity, and Justice, with experts on social policy and social work. Today's program, Beyond White Supremacy, Healing White Men as Tools for Violence Prevention and Harm Reduction, will be hosted by our colleague, Ben Jealous. Ben is a professor of practice at the Annenberg School for Communication, the Penn Law School, and SP2, all here at the University of Pennsylvania. He also serves as the president of People for the American Way. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change and racial justice that is in perfect alignment with our mission. When he was selected to head the NAACP at the age of 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generations, and SP2 has been connected with him many decades through his 105-year-old grandmother, who's an SP2 alum. As we continue to confront the pandemic and ongoing issues with racial, social, and economic justice, it's important to explore white supremacy, its evolution in recent decades, and the role that white men can play in disrupting its prevalence. This conversation is an example of SP2's dedication to addressing complex social problems through education, research, and civic engagement. And now I'm very pleased and proud to introduce you to Ben Jealous. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Dean. I'm excited about this conversation. I want to thank everybody who's joined us for this conversation. As I was coming into this conversation, I was thinking about a joke from Dick Gregory I'll tell half of, which was, he said, racism is the dog that guards the white man's house. And then he went on in a very profane way, Dick Gregory would, to explain that if Black folks could have ended racism by ourselves, we would have done so. Grew up with my dad, who taught me early on that men have a role in ending sexism and white people have a role in ending ending racism, and that's very much the spirit of the conversation today. But as I was walking into my office here at Penn, I was thinking about a walk I took at Oxford when I was a graduate student. I was trying to come up with my dissertation topic. My master's thesis topic, and I ran into a headline. It said Black teen suicide surge. And as I dug into the numbers, what struck me were two things. One, the Black teen suicide surge was Black teens really catching up with white teen suicide numbers. And the other was that the suicide rate amongst white men over 55 was then and has remained higher than the homicide rate, Black men and boys between 15 and 30. So Black men and boys at the age when they're most likely to commit homicide that we talk about all the time in our society, that rate is actually lower than the suicide rate of white men over 55, which we never talk about. And it was an affirmation for me that the importance of my father's work with a bunch of primarily white men in California, kind of digging into their own issues, doing their own work, trying to figure out how to show up better for their family, for their community. And then I also went back to a conversation Stacey Abrams and I had in a church in Georgia with a son and nephew of Klansmen whose father and uncle had participated in lynching two Black couples, the Moores Ford Bridge, cutting the baby out of a belly of one, many believe was the baby of a Klansman, and of one of the women that were lynched. It was rare because women were not as lynched as frequently in the South. And it was just grotesque. It was also one of the last lynchings in Georgia. And here he was decades later, now a fully grown man in his late 40s or 50s, just dissembling, talking about the trauma of having heard the stories from his uncle and his father as they bragged about the lynching. And it just affirmed for me that not only is Dr. King right, that we're all connected in one single garment of destiny, but that just the conceit of the civil rights movement, that you cannot dehumanize somebody else without dehumanizing yourself and everybody around you. And I heard similar stories from Bob Zellner, whose life story is now portrayed, I think, on Hulu, called Son of the South, who was, Bob was the son of a Klansman who murdered a black man in front of him. He was 8. His father lost his mind and then led his family into the civil rights movement and became a big preacher of racial reconciliation in the South, because he wasn't just a Klansman, he was also a Methodist minister. And it was the dissonance of those two that had caused him to lose his mind. And so today we're going to have a very special conversation. In addition to my father, I'll introduce in a second, we are joined by Pablo Cerdera, who's Associate Director of Restorative Practices here at Penn. And we are joined by my former student, graduate of SP2, and I believe a graduate of a couple other schools at Penn, Lauren Grisho-Shade, who's runs the Spillway and is just a very courageous advocate for social equity and inclusion and justice in the Philadelphia community. Before Lauren and Pablo joined the conversation, Dad, I want to introduce you and going to ask you a question. My father, Fred Jealous, was a student of Carl Rogers. He's the founder of something called the Breakthrough Men's Community in California, where, as he put it to me once, they kind of give men a training manual for just how to be like a happier, better human being. I really came to understand the importance of the work when men's wives were coming up to me in my early 20s at the grocery store and thanking me to tell me to thank my father for saving their marriage. And I was just like, this is awkward. But it makes an impression on a young man that your dad must be doing something important. But my father also in our community was a leader in the civil rights community broadly. And that came out of his work since his early 20s with the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, and other groups, and also as a leader in what they used to call the Men's Pro-Feminists in California. And Dad, all of that's true, and yet, you grew up in like Leave It to Beaver, Maine, a very typical kind of 1940s, 1950s childhood. As you look at this country, racial tensions increasing, racial violence on the rise, extreme, what we would used to refer to as extremism really becoming like the mainstream of at least one of our, political parties. What are the conversations that white men should be having with each other, that we should be having about white men? We should understand about how racism and racial tensions work. What's the conversations, that the work that white men should be doing if they really want to show up as vibrant members of an increasingly multi-everything society? Let's talk about beyond white supremacy, but that all is kind of wrapped up in a ball of like male supremacy, cisgendered supremacy. There's all kinds of things that are wrapped up in that. One of the things that, always impressed me about you is that there were a lot of guys who were kind of leading lights of the old men's pro-feminist movement. Most of them were like itinerant preachers. Again, I gave the same sermon. My whole life, I'd seen them give the same speech across like 20 years. You actually have worked in one community, Monterey County, with men, dozens of men every year for decades, helping them, really try to kind of, get over some childhood traumas and move past the walls that our society sets up, and trying to show up kind of as their most full selves. So what are the conversations we should be having about white men, and what are the conversations white men should be having with each other?
I think we have to start with, those of us who are white men have to start by having a conversation with ourselves about what gets in the way of us being confident of the goodness of our love in relation to all people. What keeps us from breaking out of the kind of tribal mentality or isolated mentality that we were raised in. And In my experience, we have to create an environment where men can have intimate and honest conversations outside of the role they think they have to play in order to be acceptable as a man. That is a challenge. And it means inviting men to become part of a slow-moving, deep diving community where they actually reevaluate their relationship with themselves, their relationship to sexuality, their relationship to women, their relationship to their children. And my starting place for my own thinking and creating a curriculum was that the mainstream raising of boys in the United States is generally socially sanctioned child abuse. That training young boys to be obedient to the male role as the top priority is a violation of their humanity. It denies them much more love than we are willing to admit it denies them. And it sets them up to be isolated, addictive, angry, and violent, and searching for using the other as a place to download their rage and their shame and their fear. And also using the other, in the case of things like sex addiction, using the other to get relief from the burden of playing the role they think they have to play that they hate secretly. And one of the questions we raised in Breakthrough is, when is our anger sacred? You know, when is it actually a positive force? When is our rage sacred? And in terms of the deeply personal, it's when we look at how much of our raising up to be real men was not about love. We were told that it was about love, but it was really more about obedience and shame and fear too much of the time. And I think, and I made that generalization as to help me decide how to put in the foundation. So in order to get me to be honest as a white male about how much my life is driven by fear and shame, you have to create a really safe space. You have to challenge the homophobia that keeps us isolated and objectifying each other. So you have to create a space where safety, affection, appreciation, support are all possible to help men ground themselves in the loving aspects of their humanity and in the truth of their own value. We don't start off having a negative conversation about ourselves or trying to download our distress on other humans. We start off with strong needs for affirmation, affection, safety. And too often, this is not what our childhoods are about. So that foundation has to be seen for what it is, clearly. And I think talking about, what's it about that these white men are so good at committing suicide? How come they win the suicide prize over 55? Well, it's not that complicated. If I'm playing a role my whole life and I'm not part of my community, I don't have a community that is loving, connective, supported, safe, a place to be honest, a place of true brotherhood based on love, then I have no use. My function is done. and I am alone, and I am left with these terrible feelings and no place to go. So it makes absolute sense to me that you'd find the suicide rate being that high. So the community aspect of it is important. And I started it because I started Breakthrough because, you know, when you were talking about men and child abuse or men and domestic violence or men and racism, you know, the only conversation about that human being was, he's a perpetrator, lock him up, punish the bastard. You know, and that's end of conversation. And after you work intimately with men who have been violent, you learn, yes, that's a part of who they are. But there's another, you know, dare I say, precious, untapped part of their humanity that is longing for some nourishment and attention. And that once I decided that that was true of all men, that longing, that sense of separateness, that longing, you know, when they discover that orgasm doesn't take them to the other side, it doesn't take them to a state of connectedness, that they end up in the same place with the same struggles and the same negative conversations. We need that intimate space where we can hear each other's truths. And I think that that has to happen for white men. It has to happen cross-culturally. And you see now the, you know, what we're witnessing is an explosion of shame and rage, totally misdirected. You know, the shame blame game is the game. And look at the response to Lauren's publicizing of our conversation. Oh my God. So those are some of the thoughts about it. I can't hear you, Ben.
Lauren, we're going to go to you next. We do, you know, Dad, when you were talking, one of the things that struck me is when you looked at what that suicide rate correlates with, it's social isolation.
Right.
That every type of privilege in our society seems to isolate you. Gender, wealth, you know, white men, their 50s are the richest, you know, 50 and above are the richest group historically in our society. Race, and of course, race tracks with poverty. That, you know, means you're less privileged, you live closer to people. And for white men, and then studying in England, so maybe a little bit of a bias at the time, you know, 25 years ago, what the professors at my, you know, at Oxford, kind of what we all deduced talking about it was, it seemed like the best suicide prevention institution, certainly in British culture, was the British pub, because it was the one place where these guys talked to each other. And of course, in deindustrialized America, the men's groups, you know, like the old, like Odd Fellows have dwindled, the neighborhood pubs have disappeared. And so it seems like men here are even more isolated than they are in England. Lauren?
Ben, that reminds me of where white men are showing up predominantly in public spaces, and I feel like that's in public sports, or sports is a really important place. And the second the NFL started talking more about race, the NFL viewership just started to plummet immediately. And it has been on the plummet since there have been increased conversations around race and racial justice. White people overwhelmingly don't like to talk about race. And we are the only race where a majority of us feel that way, where we talk about race too much. And when I think about where we are going as a racial minority by 2045, racial conversations are only going to increase. They're not going to go down. They're not going to go sideways, from my understanding. And so how do we hold the future is going to be more diverse, more vibrant, more connected? How do we do that? And are we doing that the right way now? Because we're trying to build the future today, right? Like the actions and the way that we're interacting with each other and loving or not loving each other is going to have a profound impact on the way that we're able to communicate and be in fellowship with each other later on. And I think one of the things that really brought me to this work is seeing so many white people hating other white people, and so much self-hate when it comes to being white. And when I saw that, it reminded me a lot of my experiences working with queer and trans young folks here in Philadelphia. And that matches in that, yes, they are very different things. Gender and sexuality are very different from race. But I kept seeing young folks having these questions around, am I lovable? Am I good enough? And in having more intentional and thoughtful conversations around race and racism in college and at this youth center that I was working at, I came to find that white people are having that exact same conversation almost en masse, trying to figure out what explicit racism looks like, what implicit racism looks like, what microaggressions look like. And if we all start lumping white people into one group or one understanding of who we are as individuals, how does that actually support us? How does it support the nuances and the intricacies of who we are as people in general? The other thing that I was thinking about too, Fred, as you were talking, there are these three quotes that kind of pull me into this work. The first is by James Baldwin. And James Baldwin says, until white people are able to love themselves, the question of being Black won't exist. The problem of being Black won't exist. The second is by Rustin. And he said, what is loved can be cured. And so we have to lead with love. And the third is RuPaul. If you can't love yourself, how are you going to love somebody else? And so bringing that into a racialized conversation has been it's been interesting to hold. And that when I try to promote these messages out in social media, I get really one of two responses. One, from the right, I get, well, don't talk about race. If you talk about race, you're the racist. We don't want to talk about this at all. Then on the left, I get, oh, no. We aren't supposed to love white people. White people aren't lovable. We're not redeemable. And so I think I have found this like really interesting way of trying to talk about race, and that both the left and the right really don't like it. In that I want to talk about race, and I want to talk about race in actually a neutral way. How can we get ourselves to come to an honest and open conversation about what it means to be white, and to do that without shame and to do that without supremacy is really difficult because of the way that we are entrenched, because of the way that we are socialized as white people to either talk or not talk, and then also how we deal with punishment. I find that that's actually like really big, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed working with Pablo and restorative practices is how do we break away from accountability abuse, and we actually start trying to build paths and inroads into a more loving community, especially when violence or harm happens. And it's not about demeaning, it's not about ostracizing or blaming as much as it is trying to understand how we act and think and behave and breathe. And that requires a very vulnerable space, Yeah, those are just kind of my initial thoughts, Ben, Fred, and Pablo. So thank you.
Sorry, Ben, there you go.
Yeah, I apologize. Pablo, why don't you just keep on riffing? I'm sure between Fred and Lauren, you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I have a lot percolating. So first of all, I just want to say a lot of gratitude to be a part of this conversation, and thank you, Ben, for the role you're playing here too, and Lauren and Fred for what you've shared. I think I might start before I respond just by situating myself and my work a little bit, just because restorative justice and restorative practices is something that's not always familiar to people. And then I think knowing our context and knowing the circumstances we find ourselves in is also really critical in the way that Fred and Lauren were already gesturing towards, to think about how to move forward. So again, I'm a restorative justice practitioner. I'm also a white man, a white Hispanic man, and so want to think about the role that plays in my life as well. I also think it's important to situate ourselves in space, and recognize that the University of Pennsylvania, and West Philadelphia, where I live and work, is on Lenni Lenape land. And I say this not as a sort of performative gesture, but actually as a way to highlight a direct source of our collective pain and trauma. And I say collective, all people who live on these lands that we call now the United States. There's a direct line between the violence of settler colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy, right? All of these structures are historical and ongoing, and are made of people, implicate people, connect people, but are not powered by the particular actions of particular evil folks, which I think is sometimes how we think about harm doers and violence. But these are kind of inherently violent structures that shape the soup we swim in, right? As a society, as a culture. So I think it's really important to recognize the deep roots of these problems, and I'll talk more about it later, I'm sure. I also want to just take a second to situate ourselves in terms of restorative justice. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a really brief way to describe the philosophy of restorative justice and restorative practices was articulated by Howard Zier, who's one of the kind of godfathers of the movement in the United States. And he describes it as a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a harm in order to identify and address harms, needs, and obligations with the ultimate goal of moving forward with healing and to help people put things as right as possible. So again, it's a big, brief overview, but it highlights a lot what Fred and Lauren were talking about, the importance of interconnectivity, of the importance of shared stake in harms, and recognizing that we have obligations to be in good relation with each other, right? To care for ourselves and our collective community. So it's very much tied up for me in this kind of concept of collective liberation, you know, this oft quoted idea that Lauren brought forward, that Fred talked about, that none of us are free until all of us are free, right? And that our liberation as white men is directly tied into the liberation of women, of Black folks, of Indigenous people, of people of color, and all sorts of other subjugated, othered, or minoritized groups. So to say that we as white men are not impacted by racism or sexism or these other systems of power is, I think, a total misrepresentation, right? We are impacted as perpetrators, as partial or total beneficiaries, and as Lauren and Fred talked about, in the spiritual and psychic harms that happen as a result of being perpetrators or benefiting from harmful systems. So recognizing that we all have needs that require attention, including those of us who cause or benefit from harm, I think is a really critical part of the restorative philosophy and resonates really deeply with what's been said so far. So if we're working on healing and we're ignoring folks who are causing harm, we risk doing a lot more harm in the long term. And I'll add also, you know, I think that Lauren, you talked about sort of hatred within whiteness, right? And white folks distancing themselves from each other. I think a lot of that also has to do with trying to separate ourselves from these harms, distance ourselves from these harms, to set ourselves up as the good white people, or as blameless, or as not implicated in these systems through our critique and saying, and through a disidentification with whiteness, as opposed to thinking about what are our individual and collective harms, needs, and obligations, right? As people who are implicated in these structures, in these systems, in these patterns. And I also will say, to build on Fred, and then I'll wrap up for now, is this idea about the centrality of community, the importance of community. I couldn't second it harder. I really do think that we need practice, we need support to be vulnerable with one another, especially as men, especially as white men who, as you said, are trained from youth to shy away from vulnerability and deep connection. And so a big part of what we do in restorative work is try to create containers where that vulnerability can be accessed and where people can practice being in closer, realer, more authentic relationship with each other, which I think has a huge role to play in healing. So I'll stop for now, but yeah, again, thanks for having me as part of this conversation.
No, absolutely. And the purpose of today's very short conversation is to really zero in on sort of dynamics between and surrounding white men. Obviously, it's in a broader context. There's a whole parallel, set of issues in the Black community of friends who are leading, for instance, the violence interrupter movement, who deal with a lot of, shame and issues of control and all that show up in the Black community. And there's a whole parallel set of issues with women. My dad's group Breakthrough was used as a model for a group called Break Free of women kind of adapting a similar set of lessons and conversations to the context of being woman. Today we're zeroing in on white males. And before going to the questions, Dad, as you were listening to Lauren and to Pablo, what kind of came up for you? What additional thoughts did you have, or could see your wheels turning? You're on mute. Apparently it's a jealous family problem. There you go.
Oh, you missed what I said. Well, I think that the thought that hit the deepest in me was, what brave men these two men are to walk into the pain. You're walking into a room filled with pain, and it's gonna, hit you at a cellular level every once in a while in a brutal way. And how necessary it is, both to walk into that space where there is so much generational pain, and also how important it is not to forget, my hope for both Lauren and Pablo is they have a really good system of support where they can grieve and be appreciated and be loved, and because it's so important not to be doing this alone. It is too much. It's too much. I learned that the hard way, so I can
Could you talk
preach
about
it
that?
by having learned it the hard way.
Yeah, Dad, could you talk about kind of where this work started for you for a second? You talk about walking to a room of pain, and what came to mind for me was your days even before Men's Alternatives to Violence when you were at the volunteer center. Could you just talk about that kind of first year of walking into a room of pain and what you learned?
Well, when the I'm old enough to have been around when the child abuse prevention programs started to be volunteer organizations in the community, and when that when during the Vietnam War the feminist movement was about the most hopeful thing in town, where you could go for looking for hope. And it was striking how silent men were around the subject of violence. Was really, the judges or the probation officers would say the right thing, but they really wouldn't show up. They'd have the little marketing thing, but I was just, and so I felt, well, this is a moment where it's time to break the silence. And I had my own fears from having experienced my dad's violence about, but it was in the engaging with people over domestic violence and child abuse, another kind of domestic violence, that really challenged me. Are you going to step forward or not? And so that was I guess the moment of a deciding conversation with myself. And then when I started working with men who were beating up women, and did it myself because I couldn't find it. Why do you want to spend time with those guys? Was what I got in 1982. Why would you want to spend time? They're all bikers with change, their violence, and I was scared because I knew if you challenge their sense of entitlement, they would probably attack me. So I had that fear running as well. But what I learned from that was, man, these men are reenacting child abuse. When you heard their story that was underneath their present time behavior, it was like, oh my God, the childhood is the father of man, like that quote says. And then I realized that, it's not just the men who are being physically abusive. It's the men, all men have problems with anger, all men have control issues, all men have addiction issues. Pick your cocktail. It's money and booze and sex, or whatever the combination is, whatever the cocktail of choice. So that's when I realized that, one, trying to do it alone, what really convinced me to not do it alone, the shocker was the second man who came up to me after the meeting and said, "Can I talk to you?" And he said, "I need to tell somebody that I murdered this guy in South County. I got my Vietnam veterans to kill this guy. And I've never been caught and I need to tell somebody." Well, talk about having pain dumped in your lap and no place to go. I'm not a priest, I'm not a cop, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a teacher. And I realized I could not continue to put myself in a position, so that community was essential. So I got a group of men together and I said, we're going to be in training until every man in this room is willing to lead. Not watch me lead, but lead. And that took 6 months. And I think that program still goes on. But, and this is slightly a bit of a tangent, but I think if you look at, this problem in the context of all the other big problems, my rabbi friend is right. We need a new love story that everybody can be a part of.
Amen.
We need a new love story that everybody can be a part of without giving up their uniqueness.
Yeah, as Dr. King would remind us, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that.
I hope that got what you wanted, Ben.
No, it's good. I think it's just important, kind of grounded in the work. We're talking the context of, SP2, social policy, social practice. When your mother-in-law was here in the early 50s, very early 50s before Brown, this was School of Social Work. So I thought it was important to kind of ground it in the work and describe what those rooms of pain are like. I want to get to the questions here. And Lauren, if you go down, somebody's asking for your personal information, so I'll let you handle that one directly. One question from Lois asks, isn't the common thread through racism, sexism, ageism, etc., homophobia, that's control? And then Priscilla kind of prompts, please don't leave women out of the discussion. Clearly, we are the other half. Dad, I'm going to direct the second one to you, but Lauren and Pablo, how would you respond to Lois's question? Isn't all this at the end of the day just about control, all the isms?
I can go ahead and take a first attempt at talking about this. I think for a certain way of thinking about it, I think the answer is yes, and on a certain level, right? Where these all these isms that we're talking about are about power structures, right? They're about imbalances of power. And what is power? The power is the ability to control your own life and the circumstances that surround you, right? Power in itself isn't a bad thing, right? We all deserve to have power to exercise our agency, to be able to control our own lives and the circumstances around us. Where it becomes harmful is when that power shifts to domination and control, as you're describing. And I think that part of the reason for those that kind of control and the violence that comes along with trying to control others has to do with the sort of cognitive dissonance, spiritual wounds that folks, particularly folks who are in structurally empowered positions, find themselves experiencing. So I define spiritual wounds. We could have a long conversation about spiritual harm and spiritual wounding, but one of the aspects of it that is relevant here that I want to bring up is that experience that we have when our conception of ourselves, our conception of who we are supposed to be, right, as Fred was describing, based on our upbringing and based on these kind of societal power structures, misaligns with our actual experience, right? I think a lot of times people experience that misalignment as a spiritual harm, right? And from there comes this reactive, defensive desire to exercise control, or this feeling of woundedness, right? So, somebody in the comments I saw talked about not all white men are wealthy and prosperous. And that's true, right? That's very true. And I think part of what we see with this rise in white supremacist violence is the disconnect, the dissonance between a power structure, between a national narrative that is rooted, in my analysis, in white supremacy, in the idea that white men are meant to be the pinnacle of social power, and a reality in which that is less and less fully the case, right? But that idea, that structure, that narrative hasn't gone away. And so I think a lot of times people are experiencing a shift towards greater equality as a spiritual wound, as knocking them from what they understand on an explicit or implicit level as their rightful place in society, which then causes a lot of internal and external harm, and the desire and the application of domination and control. So again, I think it's got deep roots in our, as I'm saying, in our context, and these kind of structural power hierarchies and these narratives, and then also in people's lived experiences. So I don't know if that directly speaks to the question, but that's what came up to mind for me.
Powerful. It's powerful. Lauren?
I think Pablo, I think you hit it right on the head, and I'm not really going to add anything much more of substance outside of, I think that woke culture and conspiratorial culture are these power grabs for control. And at the end of the day, this is about controlling language. It's about controlling ideology. And especially, I have all of the right tools that you don't. And so then therefore I am needed. And I don't think, for me, a lot of the work of the spillway is that there's this uptick in this rhetoric around woke culture and conspiratorial culture, while we're seeing the decline of whiteness as the normal or the status quo. And so they are, from my hypothesis, from my experience, they are also like deeply connected. And I don't think that we can like shy away from the way that our language, the way that our culture is evolving and changing. One of the things that I also think a lot about is even the way that we define racism. We say that it is social power plus discrimination. And what does that look like in 100 years? Are white people still going to have social power? The question mark is probably not. And so even the very language that we're using now is in flux. And it's not going to be this light switch moment in 2045 where we go, oh, wait. White people don't have social power anymore. So now let's reframe the way that we're talking about this. But this is like slow morph. It's the slow burn that I think white people are feeling of, oh, wait, I think that reverse racism exists. Oh, but actually it doesn't exist, but maybe it does exist, but not right now. And I think that flux creates this need to control and this need to find stability, to find grounding. so that we know which way is up.
Yeah.
That's all I really wanted to add.
You know, well, I think it also, and I'll come to you, Dan, in a second with the question about, you know, women and, you know, in this work and in relation to men, because that question was asked about kind of women in relation to men. To also really kind of understand like what race is, you know, on a couple of levels, right? Like race historically amongst like Europe was a word for tribe or for nation. We Scots are a mighty race, right? If you go in back in the, you know, Oxford dictionary, that's what you're going to find, right? In the OED, that's what you're going to find. Race in America, and then through America, kind of globally, 100 years after 1619, like in the 1700s, the scholarship of Barbara Fields, for which she won a MacArthur Genius Award, taught us, well, that's when the modern American notion of race as you know, blacks as the missing link, if you will, between man and monkey, blacks as chattel, blacks as animals. Suddenly, the race roles themselves, which in the 1600s had been people of nationalities picked up at different ports in Africa, becomes Negroes picked up with no nationality, listed like cattle and other forms of chattel. And so the question is, well, then why? Like, what you get into, right, are the colonial rebellions of the 1600s and African slaves and Irish indentured servants rebelling together, and the splitting of those groups. First, the difference between slave and indentured servant, but also then the difference between white and black. And when you look at Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail and his conversation with his white jailer, and saying, you know, basically saying to him, like, you should be on our side, because this whole game's being run against both of us. The fact that most white men aren't rich, just like most people in America aren't rich, that's like the point of racism, you know, at the beginning, if you will, is keeping one group in power and most people not in power. My grandmother's 105. You hear me talk about a lot. I really have been interrogating her life for a book that's coming out in HarperCollins in January called Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, which is a riddle I inherited from her. And her grandfather walks out of slavery in Virginia. He's living in his uncle's house. His owner is his uncle. He walks across the corpses of dead Confederates, as well as Union soldiers, but the Confederates were his cousins, to watch Lee surrender to Grant, and Lee was his cousin. And given yet all of that horrible history, he goes on at the end of Reconstruction, the very, very end of the 1880s, early 1880s, to lead a populist uprising with a Confederate general who was best known prior to that for massacring an entire black regiment that had surrendered at the Battle of the Crater. And why? Because a very wealthy group of former plantation owners that both men detested for various reasons were trying to defund public education in Virginia, which was only a creation of Reconstruction, free public education for every child in the state. It's created during Reconstruction, because they said, these far right-wing conservatives at the time said, the state couldn't afford its Civil War debt and free public education. And so all these working class white men and working class black men who previously been opposite sides of a war band together. And what put down that populist movement in Virginia of the early 1880s was a violent white supremacist movement funded by white business owners who were threatened by black business owners taking over increasing share of the marketplace, and were and were worried that not just poor blacks, but poor whites would become ungovernable if they got an education. And so, you know, I mean, that's the other thing, right? I think that where we ultimately have to get to is that white men, most of them, the ones who aren't rich, definitely have a vested interest in ending racism, because a big part of this has been a game to hold most folks back in this society, including them. Dad, I want to get though to the intimate question that was asked. You know, Priscilla said, you know, and I think in a very sort of traditional American, you know, way, and she said that she's 78. So, you know, I think, you know, that women are the other half of every man. And certainly for straight men who are married, that's very much like mom and you are, you know, yin and yang. When you're talking about sort of dealing with these issues of, you know, racism and patriarchy and kind of helping men become full human beings, less you show up in a more human, less toxic way. Where are women in that conversation? What's the, you know, all those grateful wives at the grocery store? Like, what's their role in all this? Dad, turn on your, you're on mute. All right. I'm gonna sing.
So you want me to speak for women?
Yeah. No,
Well,
I wanted
well,
to speak as a man
yeah.
about, you know, who leads other
Okay,
men
so
about what
if
you
we're
tell them
looking
to be.
if we're looking at the tradition,
Yeah,
you know, okay, so in that, all the extremes of that compulsively binary world, men are raised to compete, win, and dominate in a zero-sum game where you're either a winner or a loser. Now that's part of the shame bind that men carry. Women, in that traditional sense, needed men for security. So you very often have relationships between men and women set up as, okay, it's women's job to, in exchange for some measure of security, to give men relief and comfort and release from the strains of trying to perform this role successfully day in and day out. So you are not entitled to challenge me. You're not allowed to threaten my playing of the role. So that's the tradition, which is we've been breaking down, slowly over the past years. Men need it to break down as well for their own relief. But I think that, women discovering, as women discover, more self-love and more of their own capacity, and how vital it is for them to be at the table and the difference they make, and that they don't have to live inside of that model. That's a huge shift. And it's also, without men making a similar shift, men are stuck in that same paradigm, thinking that they have to be a winner, they have to play the role, that they have to be a success object of some kind. And that entitles them to services. So I don't think men have moved in the same way that women have. You see this in the resistance to, taking on jobs that aren't manly and industrial. As the service sector increases, you see a lot of the resistance, with men who say they won't do that kind of job. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks, Ted. Any closing thoughts, Lauren, Pablo?
I would say, I think this conversation is reinforced for me. There is this paradox of being white in America, and that is we are simultaneously the perpetrators and the victims of race and racism. And we don't have and haven't had services and resources to support that unique kind of balancing act that white people, that we find ourselves on. And that is why this spillway is trying to be here, is to support that very unique paradox that we exist within. And I just want to touch a brief moment on this idea that white people are victims, because I know that that's also going to hit, I think, white men specifically in this really intense way. I am not a victim. Victim is actually the opposite of what men are supposed to feel. I think it's about power and control, right? But it is actually, when I think about racism as almost a trauma response nowadays. And we think about how, looking at the manifestations of how white men specifically are talking or not talking about race and racism, this preoccupation with race, the increased skepticism or cynicism, the irrationality, the emotional detachment. These are all textbook trauma responses. I don't, and for that, I don't believe in white fragility as much as I believe in perpetration-induced traumatic stress. I think that that's actually what we're dealing with. And if we reframe the way that we're actually looking and talking and holding space for white people, it's actually to say, oh, wow, you're hurting too. You are hurting because of race and racism too. And so let's support you. Let's support this as well. And this isn't to like stop the entire movement and say, hey, let's like all focus on white people for a moment. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is part of the larger process of racial justice and equity. But we haven't been doing preventative work. And so we just keep seeing the same cycles of, oh no, let's do harm reduction. Let's try to put a Band-Aid over this. But what are we actually trying to do to prevent racism in the country? I know in a lot of spaces like SP2, the very first, I think, mission within the school is to promote education. And education is really important, but then how do we internalize that? How do we feel that emotionally and spiritually on top of an intellectual experience? And I think that that's really where the spillway comes in. How do we have this fully embodied experience about eradicating racism from our lives and the lives of those around us? It's a lot of what's kind of been bubbling to the surface for me in this conversation.
Amen. Amen. Pablo?
Yeah, I'll say just briefly in sort of summation of some of what I've been thinking about, we need to address both the individual, interpersonal, and structural harms, right, that permeate our culture and our society and our everyday lives, and recognize also that all people who cause harm, right, all people are capable of harm, but particularly in this conversation, white men are not predominantly monsters, right, but our people, all of us, have the power to do both beautiful and monstrous things, depending on the level to which we're able to attend to our own needs and recognize and attend to the needs of other people that we are in community with, even if we don't have those active practice connections with them. So again, for me, it means looking historically and structurally and also interpersonally. Dr. Edward Valandra, who's a Lakota scholar and restorative justice leader, talks about, the first harm of US is the dispossession of the land through genocide, and the second harm is the kidnapping, enslavement of African people. And, through this lens of the wisdom of the kind of concept of Sankofa, that we have to look back to move forward, right? Those harms and their ongoing ramifications and permutations, we have to address those in ourselves and in our culture as we move forward as individuals and as a society in a good way. So to noticing the time, I'll say less. I'll say healing and accountability are bound up in each other, right?
Amen.
And that we have to address those things kind of connectedly and recognize that we all have needs that require attention.
Amen. Well, with that, we're going to come to an end too soon, but we're right on time. Usually, Associate Dean Jerry Bourgeois-Lee closes us out. Jerry, would you like to close us out?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, Fred, Pablo, and Lauren for this incredibly thought-reflective, thought-provoking, and informative discussion. As SP2's Associate Dean for Inclusion, I want to emphasize that conversations like this one are vital to our school's mission. This is a prime example of the kind of necessary dialogue we continue to encourage in our community. SP2 remains steadfast to its commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, intersectionality, inclusion, diversity, and social justice within our 5-degree programs and throughout our interactions with colleagues, our students, alums, and our external partners. I invite you to learn more about our work by visiting our inclusion page, and the link for that page will be in the chat box. Thanks to everyone who has joined us today, and details will be coming out very soon about our next speaker series event, which will be on April the 12th, and the title is A Scalable Approach to Economic Inclusion. I hope you'll be able to make it, so please stay tuned. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, Jerry. And to the other speakers, there's a bunch of questions. If you're
Thank
able
you,
to,
everyone.
please do answer some of them. Thanks, Dean Bach.